The Shadow Haven. Life had stripped her of everything, leaving only the emptiness of a house that was no longer hers and the pain of a future that would never come to pass. Mary was only 28 years old when fate decided to rewrite her story in a way she never could have imagined. A widow, without resources and without a place to call home, she accepted living on an isolated property that everyone in the region avoided as if it were cursed. And what she discovered within those old walls not only changed her life, but also saved an existence that was about to be extinguished forever. This story happened in a rural region in the American South in 1933, at a time when America still bore the deep scars of recent conflicts and life in the countryside was governed by unbreakable traditions and ancient superstitions. If you've ever felt everything crumbling around you, that there were no more open doors, no hand extended, leave your comment telling us how you found the strength to carry on. Your experience might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. And if stories like this touch your heart, be sure to join our community to follow every narrative we lovingly prepare for you. Morning arrived with the crowing of roosters and the damp aroma of earth wet from the previous night's drizzle. Mary awoke that March day with a heavy heart, feeling the weight of an absence that would never cease to ache. The small studio where she and her husband Peter worked with artisanal ceramics was steeped in a sepulchral silence, so different from the days when laughter and conversations filled every corner of that space. Peter had been gone for 5 weeks, taken by a fulminant pneumonia that gave no chance for goodbyes. 3 days of high fever and delirium, and then absolute emptiness. Mary was 28 years old, childless, without close family, and with a future that seemed as fragile as the still damp clay pieces on the shelves. The house where they lived, the studio they had built together during 8 years of marriage, everything belonged to Peter's family. And now that he was no longer there, Mary was just a painful reminder of better times, a burden no one wanted to carry. Frank, Peter's older brother, appeared that morning, his face etched with guilt and necessity. He was a man of principles, but the destitution threatening to swallow his own family forced him to make decisions that gnawed at his conscience. He knocked on the studio door with his knuckles, avoiding looking directly at Mary when she opened it. His voice came out hoarse, laden with a weight he could barely bear. "Mary, I need to tell you something that will hurt me as much as it will hurt you. Peter left debts I didn't even know existed. The bank is pressing. Creditors are knocking on the door every day. I have no choice. I need to sell this house, the studio, everything. You have until the end of the month to find another place. I'm so sorry. I truly am." The words fell upon her like stones, each one crushing a little more of what remained of her hope. Mary felt her legs weaken, but she forced herself to remain standing, clinging to the doorframe as if that could prevent the collapse of her world. "Frank, please, this is the only place I have. It's where Peter and I built our dreams. I have nowhere to go. I have no one." He shook his head, eyes downcast, unable to meet her gaze. "I know, Mary. It pains my soul to have to do this, but the debts are greater than any memory. Peter left nothing in writing, no will. You were his wife, his companion, but before the law now, you have no right to any of it. Banks don't forgive." The words, though spoken with genuine regret, sounded like a death sentence. Mary knew arguing was useless. In rural America of that era, a young widow without a formal inheritance and without close relatives was like a dry leaf carried by the wind, with no control over her own destiny. Frank left, leaving only the echo of his apologies in the air. Mary stood in the middle of the studio, surrounded by the ceramic pieces she and Peter had molded together, silent witnesses to a love that was now just a memory. 8 years of marriage, of turning the potter's wheel side by side, of planning a house full of children and art, all turning to dusk before her eyes. She spent the following days in a desperate search for help, for any friendly hand that could offer shelter. She went to her friend Teresa's house, who received her with a tight embrace, but with tears in her eyes as she explained that her husband wouldn't allow another mouth to feed. "Times are too hard, Mary. We can barely manage our own. If it were up to me, you know you'd stay, but I can't go against my husband," Teresa said, her voice choked with sadness. Mary tried to find work at the crafts fair in the neighboring town, where her glazed ceramic pieces were known and admired. Mr. Arthur, the most respected merchant in the square, had always praised her talent, but when she approached him asking for an opportunity, the man only sighed heavily. "Mary, your work is among the best I've ever seen, but no one is buying decorations now. People barely have money for the basics. I can't offer you anything, much as I wish I could." Even Mrs. Cecilia, an elderly local wise woman who always bought bowls to prepare her medicinal teas, sadly refused, holding Mary's hands in her wrinkled, herb-stained ones. "Child, if I could help you, I would without a second thought. But my own house is falling apart and my pantry is empty. Besides, you know how people are. They say having a young widow in the house scares off suitors for unmarried girls, brings bad luck. These are old superstitions, I know, but I can't defy my own family." Mary returned to the empty studio with a broken heart and the painful certainty that she was completely alone in the world. Less than 3 weeks remained until she had to leave the only home she had ever known, and she had absolutely nowhere to go. The following Sunday, moved more by habit than by faith, Mary went to Mass at the main church. Perhaps it would be the last time she would kneel on those dark wooden pews where she had prayed alongside Peter so many times. She sat in the last row, her head covered by her black mourning shawl, trying to hold back the tears that insisted on escaping. Father Anthony, a man with white hair and deep eyes who knew every story in that village, celebrated the Mass with his grave, measured voice. He knew the joys and tragedies of each family, carried the weight of the confidences and sins of his flock. When Mass ended and the faithful began to disperse under the strong midday sun, Father Anthony made a discreet sign for Mary to approach. She obeyed with slow steps, feeling the curious gaze of some women who whispered behind their hand fans. "Mary, my child, I've heard about your situation. Frank came to speak with me. The man is racked with guilt over what he has to do." Mary nodded, unable to speak, feeling shame burn her cheeks. "I have a possible solution for you," the priest continued in his calm, measured voice. "It's not ideal, far from it, but it's better than being out on the streets. It's a roof over your head at least." Mary's eyes lit up for a brief instant, a flicker of hope trembling amidst the despair. "There's an old house in the foothills, about 6 kilometers from here, going up the creek trail. The people call the Hill House. You must have heard of it." Mary felt a shiver run down her spine. Of course, she had heard of that place. Everyone in the region knew the Hill House. It was an adobe and terracotta-tiled building, abandoned for over a decade. They told terrifying stories about that place, saying a terrible tragedy had occurred there during conflicts between government and rebel forces, that at night one could hear screams and cries echoing through the walls, that shadows moved through the empty windows even when no one was around. No one dared to climb up there, not even the bravest hunters in the region. "Father, I've already heard the stories about that place," Mary murmured, her voice trembling. "They say it's haunted, that terrible things happened there." The priest raised his hand in a placating gesture, gently interrupting her. "Those are just stories, my daughter, rumors born of people's fear and ignorance. That house belonged to the Olivers, good, hard-working folk, but they were caught in the middle of a violent confrontation. A tragedy, yes, but the house itself is solid. It has strong walls, a roof that still protects from the rain. It could be your refuge. But Father, if it was such a good house, why does no one live there? Why was it abandoned like this? Because people are afraid of what they don't understand. They associate the house with the pain and suffering that happened there. But I know the true story, and I assure you there's nothing supernatural about that place. There are only sad memories and a past that has yet to be overcome. Mary swallowed hard. The idea of living alone in that house filled her with dread, but what was the alternative? Sleeping under bridges? Begging for food at doors? Can I really live there? The Olivers won't object? None of them are left, Mary. They all perished that night. The property passed to the diocese years ago. I give you permission. You can move in when you're ready. Here is the key. Mary took a deep breath. She had no choice. It was either accept this or face absolute destitution on the streets. I accept, Father. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for this opportunity. 4 days later, carrying only a small bundle with her clothes, some ceramic tools she had managed to hide from Frank, and the last piece of bread she had left, Mary began the climb up the steep trail that led to the foothills. The path was rugged, full of loose stones and exposed roots that seemed to want to trip her. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the air grew thinner as she ascended. Below, the settlement became a miniature, a painful reminder of the life that had been torn from her. The house appeared suddenly, nestled into the hillside of the foothills, as if the mountain itself wished to hide it from the rest of the world. It was larger than Mary expected, with thick adobe walls cracked by time and a terracotta-tiled roof where moss and small plants had found shelter. The windows, long devoid of glass, looked like empty eyes staring into nothing. The wooden gate, eaten away by years of wear and rain, hung from a single rusty hinge. Mary walked around the property, observing everything carefully. There was a stone well covered in wild vines, 2 fig trees that hadn't seemed to bear fruit in years, and the remains of what was once a chicken coop, all enveloped in a silence so profound it was unsettling. She opened the front door with the heavy iron key the priest had given her. The lock was seized with rust and resisted for a few seconds before giving way with a loud click that echoed through the still air. The door groaned open, a long, mournful sound, as if complaining about being awakened after so many years of sleep. A strong smell of mold, accumulated dust, and damp wood invaded her nostrils, the characteristic scent of frozen time. Mary entered slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The main room was spacious, but plunged into gloom. There were some heavy pieces of furniture, covered by white cloths, now gray with dirt. A large mahogany table, chairs overturned on the floor, a wooden chest ajar. The walls were stained by dampness and salt marks, the characteristic scent of frozen time. Mary entered slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The main room was spacious, but plunged into gloom. There were some heavy pieces of furniture, covered by white cloths, now gray with dirt. A large mahogany table, chairs overturned on the floor, a wooden chest ajar. The walls were stained by dampness and salt marks, and the wide plank floor creaked under her bare feet. She climbed the wooden stairs cautiously, each step protesting under her weight. The upper floor had 3 small bedrooms. She chose the one with a window facing the valley. At least from there, she could see the distant lights of the settlement during the night, a reminder that she wasn't completely isolated from the world of the living. She cleaned the room as best she could, swept away the cobwebs and accumulated dust, opened the window to let the fresh air circulate and chase away the ghosts of abandonment, and spread her only blanket on the floor as the old wooden bed was broken and infested with termites. She lit a candle she had brought with her, and so she spent her first night in the hill house. The silence was oppressive, absolute, suffocating. Every creak of the wood made her jump. Every whistle of the wind passing through the broken tiles sounded like a human lament, like the moans of lost souls. Mary prayed the rosary countless times, clutching the beads as if they were a lifeline in an ocean of fear. Finally, exhaustion overcame her dread, and she fell asleep. When she awoke in the morning, with the first rays of sun penetrating the dusty window, she realized she had survived. The house hadn't collapsed on her. No spirit had come to torment her. She allowed herself a tired, sad smile. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could survive there. With the first light of day, Mary gathered her courage and went down to explore the rest of the property. She needed to know every corner if she intended to make that place her home. The kitchen was spacious, dominated by a brick wood-burning stove that, surprisingly, seemed to be in reasonable working condition. She found some old clay pots and chipped plates. They would serve her needs. She decided her first task would be to get water. She went out the back door towards the stone well she had seen the day before. The morning was clear, the sky a deep and intense blue, and the overgrown vegetation around the house muffled any sound from the outside world. It was like being on an island floating above the valley. The solitude was so dense it seemed to have weight, but the sunlight brought a strange sense of peace. Mary leaned over the well and looked down. The water was visible at the bottom, clear and still as a mirror. With effort, she managed to lower the wooden bucket tied to the old worn rope. To her relief, it worked. She pulled up the first bucket of fresh, crystalline water. At least she wouldn't die of thirst there. She was about to go back inside when she heard it. It was a faint, muffled sound, almost imperceptible, like a stifled cough or a low moan of pain. Mary froze with the bucket in her hand. Her heart, which had calmed for a moment, began to pound uncontrollably again. She heard it again. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was definitely a human sound. It came from the back of the property, beyond the remains of the ruined chicken coop, where the foundations of an even older structure were lost amidst the tall grass. Twigs that clung to her skirt and scratched her legs. She approached a pile of crumbled stones and bricks, the remains of what seemed to have been a small pantry or cellar. The sound came from there, from beneath the earth. With her heart pounding, she began to clear away the branches and brick pieces with her bare hands. The earth was loose in one spot, as if there had been a recent cave-in. Beneath a pile of broken tiles and rotted beams, she saw the edge of a dark wooden trapdoor. It was almost completely covered, but a small crack allowed the sound to escape. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pushed and dragged the debris until she could grasp a rusty iron ring. She pulled with all her weight. The trapdoor, swollen with dampness, resisted, but finally gave way with a dull, frightening creak. A gust of cold, damp air hit her face. She peered into the darkness and called out, her voice trembling, "Is anyone there?" In response, she heard a muffled, desperate sob. She knelt, letting her eyes adjust to the gloom, and then she saw her. Huddled in a corner on a pile of old, torn sacks was a small girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. She was dirty, covered in dust and earth, with dry, cracked lips and huge, terrified eyes fixed on Mary. "Oh, my God, blessed Mother," Mary whispered, her soul suspended between absolute panic and overwhelming compassion. She slid into the damp cellar, feeling the cold earth penetrate her knees. The air smelled of mold and despair. The girl didn't move. Only her huge, dark eyes followed her every movement, like a frightened wild animal caught in a trap. She didn't cry, made no sound, as if fear had stolen her voice forever. Mary extended a trembling hand, slowly, very slowly, so as not to frighten her further. "I won't hurt you, little one. I'm here to help you. What's your name?" she asked in the softest voice she could produce. The girl just huddled deeper into herself, clinging to the dusty sacks as if they were her only protection in the world. Mary then saw that she was trembling, not just from fear, but from a profound cold that penetrated her bones. Her dress was a dirty, torn rag, and her bare feet were covered in wounds and cuts. How long had she been down there? Whole days? A week? It was a miracle she was still alive. With desperate urgency, Mary approached and, without a second thought, picked her up in her arms. The girl was incredibly light, a small bundle of fragile bones and icy skin. She offered no resistance, simply letting herself be lifted, her head falling languidly onto Mary's shoulder. Mary felt a wave of protective fury. Who could do such a thing to an innocent child? Abandon her in a hole to die of hunger and fear? She rushed into the house with the girl clinging to her as if she were the most precious treasure in the universe. The sunlight greeted them as they emerged, making the girl blink rapidly, and for an instant she hid her face in Mary's neck, fleeing a brightness she surely hadn't seen in a very long time. She entered the kitchen, gently placed the girl on the cloth covering the mahogany table, and rushed to light the wood-burning stove. She urgently needed warmth. She needed to warm that tiny life that was fading. As the first flames began to crackle and pop, Mary wet a piece of her shawl in fresh well water and delicately began to clean the girl's face. The dirt hid delicate features and pale skin, almost translucent from lack of sun. Her lips were cracked and purplish from the cold and dehydration. "Calm down, my child. Calm down. You're safe now. I'll take care of you," she whispered repeatedly, more to convince herself that it was real than to calm the little one who remained in absolute silence. She wrapped her in her own blanket, the only piece of shelter she possessed, and cradled her near the fire, which was already radiating comforting warmth through the adobe walls. Gradually, the girl's trembling began to subside. Mary brought a spoonful of water to her lips, and after several patient attempts, the little one drank with an eagerness that broke Mary's heart. She was dying of thirst. The sounds in the house weren't ghost laments. They were the whimpers of this girl fighting to survive alone in the dark. And she, Mary, had found her. Perhaps her own desolate destiny had brought her here precisely for this moment, for this purpose. As the girl dozed by the warmth of the fire, exhausted and fragile as a fallen nestling, Mary observed her more closely. There was nothing on her that suggested an identity. No medal around her neck, no embroidery on her tattered clothes. But looking at her, at the curve of her cheek and the delicacy of her eyelashes, Mary felt she couldn't keep calling her the girl. She decided to give her a name, and she chose Clara, because that was what she had brought to the darkness of her life, an unexpected and tiny point of clarity amidst the shadows. The reality, however, was stark and urgent. Water wouldn't be enough. Clara was starving. Her ribs showed beneath her thin skin, and she needed real food, something to restore her strength. Mary looked at her own provisions, a piece of hard bread and a handful of dried beans. She had nothing suitable to offer such a debilitated child. Anguish gripped her. She needed to return to the settlement. She needed to seek help, swallow her pride and her fear, and beg if necessary. She carefully wrapped Clara in the blanket, making sure her face was protected, and held her firmly against her chest. With her heart pounding, she began the descent down the same trail that had led her to her exile days earlier. Every step was a battle against humiliation. When she reached the settlement, the few people who saw her pass moved away, muttering under their breath and making the sign of the cross. The widow from the haunted house was back. She ran directly to the house of Mrs. Benita, the local midwife and healer. She was her only hope. The old woman was pounding herbs in her mortar when she saw Mary at her door, breathless and with a bundle in her arms. "Child, what happened? What are you bringing there?" she asked, frowning. Mary, out of breath, could barely speak. She uncovered a corner of the blanket, revealing Clara's pale face. "I found her, Mrs. Benita. I found her in the house. She was trapped underground. She's dying. Please help me." Mrs. Benita recoiled a step, her face a mask of horror. She made the sign of the cross quickly and repeatedly. "Jesus, Mary, Joseph, it's the Wailing Girl, the curse of the Olivers. Child, you shouldn't have brought her here. It will bring misfortune to all of us." "It's no curse," Mary pleaded, tears streaming down her dust-streaked cheeks. "Look at her. She's flesh and blood. She's cold and hungry. She's not a ghost. She's a child. For God's sake, help her." The desperation in Mary's voice seemed to break through the old woman's wall of superstition. Mrs. Benita hesitated, looking from the girl to Mary and back to the little one. Finally, she sighed, a long, resigned sound. "Come in quickly before anyone sees." Once inside the gloom of the little house that smelled of lavender and rosemary, the healer examined Clara with expert, calloused hands. Her hardened face softened, the sternness replaced by professional concentration. "She's malnourished and suffered a great shock. Fear entered her blood and stole her spirit. But she will live. You arrived just in time. One more day in that hole and you would have found her dead." The healer acted with surprising speed. She prepared a thin broth of herbs and chicken and taught Mary how to give it to Claire with a small spoon, drop by drop, with infinite patience. The girl drank slowly, her eyes still fixed on the void, but she drank. It was a good sign. "This girl was abandoned on purpose, Mary," said Miss Benita with a grim certainty as she watched Claire sleep, her breathing now more regular and less shallow. "Whoever left her in that hole knew the house was empty, that no one would go up there for years. They left her to die in the dark." The horror of those words pierced Mary's chest like a knife. But who would do such a thing? Who would leave a child to her own fate in such a cruel manner? The healer sighed, a sound laden with the weight of all she had seen in her long life. "It happens more than you imagine, child. Times of misery, of men going to war and never returning, of women unable to feed the children they have. Conflicts and rebellions left many broken souls and destroyed families. Sometimes they leave children on church doorsteps, hoping a charitable soul will find them. Sometimes they simply leave them where no one can hear their cries." Mary looked at the sleeping child, at that fragile miracle cradled in her lap. The idea that her life had been discarded like that was an unbearable wound. "I can't leave her," Mary declared, her voice a mere whisper but charged with unshakable determination. "I can't hand her over to an authority that doesn't exist, or to an orphanage that will treat her like a nameless object." Miss Benita stared at her, her dark eyes examining the young widow's soul. "Mary, do you know what you're saying? To raise a child alone, a penniless widow, in a house everyone believes to be cursed? People will talk. They'll invent terrible stories about you and about her." "Let them talk," Mary replied, stroking Claire's tangled hair. "God put her in my path for some reason. I was alone, and now she is here. I will take care of her." Miss Benita sighed again, but this time a glint of admiration lit up her tired eyes. "You are brave, girl, or you are crazy, or perhaps both are the same thing. Take this bag. It has some corn, beans, and herbs to calm her spirit. You will need strength. Come back in a week so I can see how she is." Mary thanked her with a full heart and started her way back to the foothills, with Claire sleeping peacefully against her chest and the bag of provisions on her shoulder. The climb seemed different this time. She was no longer walking towards exile, but towards a home. For the first time since Peter's death, she didn't feel completely alone in the world. Upon arriving, she dedicated herself to caring for Claire with total and absolute devotion. She fed her, cleaned her, sang her the lullabies her own mother had sung when she was little. The girl still didn't speak, but her eyes were no longer empty and dead. Now they followed Mary around the room, observing every movement with silent curiosity. One afternoon, while washing the rags Claire wore, something small and hard fell from a hidden torn pocket. It was a small wooden figure carved with surprising dexterity, a tiny hummingbird with its wings open mid-flight. It was a beautiful piece, polished by the touch of small fingers over time. Whose was it? What did it mean? The question settled in her mind, a mystery that added another layer to the enigmatic existence of the girl she had saved. The days in the foothills turned into weeks that seemed to follow their own rhythm, separate from the rest of the world. Mary and Claire developed a silent routine, a wordless communication woven through gestures and glances. Claire still didn't speak, but her eyes no longer reflected the absolute terror of that first terrible day. Now there was genuine childlike curiosity in them. She followed Mary everywhere, watching as she gathered firewood, tried to fix the roof, or molded small figures with the clay she found near the dry creek. One day, as Mary kneaded the damp clay, Claire approached, took a piece, and with her clumsy little fingers tried to imitate her. It was the first act of self-will, the first bud of a life that was slowly returning. Mary felt a wave of tenderness so intense it almost physically hurt in her chest. That girl was an arid field that with patience and love was beginning to bloom again. The small wooden hummingbird became Claire's treasure. She clutched it to sleep and carried it everywhere with her like a protective talisman. For Mary, that small carved bird was not just a toy. It was the only key, the only tangible clue to the girl's past, a thread that might lead to answers she didn't even know if she wanted to find. One morning, seeing that her meager provisions were running out again, Mary decided to go down to the settlement once more. This time, however, she wasn't just going for food. She put the hummingbird in her apron pocket with the vague hope of finding someone who recognized the carving style, who could give some clue about the object's origin. While Claire took a nap in the house, safe for the first time in a long while, Mary descended to the settlement, avoiding the main square and looking for the alleys where artisans usually worked. In a small shed shaded by an old mango tree, she found an elder carving a saint's image. His gnarled and stained hands moved with hypnotic and admirable precision. It was Mr. Nux. Jasper, the settlement's carver, a man who, they said, could give soul to dead wood. With her heart pounding, Mary approached slowly. "Good afternoon, master," she said timidly. The elder looked up. His small, bright eyes examined her calmly. "Miss Mary, Peter's widow, they say you now live in the foothills, in the abandoned house." The news, as always, had traveled faster than the gossip-laden wind. "That's right, sir," she replied, deciding to get straight to the point. "I wanted to ask you something. It's about your work, about your art." She took out the small hummingbird and placed it in the palm of her outstretched hand. "I found this. Do you recognize this work, this carving style?" Mr. Jasper took the small bird with a reverent, almost religious delicacy. His fingers traced the smooth wings, the delicate curve of the slender beak. He remained silent for a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, and when he looked up, his face had visibly paled. "By all the saints in heaven," he whispered, his voice choked. "Where did you find this girl?" "It was with a child," Mary began to explain. He interrupted her, his voice laden with sudden deep emotion. "This piece, I haven't seen one like it in over 10 years. Only one man carved hummingbirds like this, with this unique style. My friend Anthony Oliver's, the man who lived in Hill House, right where you are now." Mary felt the air leave her lungs. "But people say he and his family all died." "And so they did," the elder confirmed, with a profound sadness that weighed in his voice. "A tragedy of the war, of the rebellions. Anthony was a man of peace, a wood artist, but they accused him of helping the rebels hiding in the foothills. Government soldiers went up to the house one night and killed them all without mercy, him, his wife Eleanor, and their little daughter Christine. Anthony carved these hummingbirds for her. He said they were messengers of the soul, carrying prayers to heaven. He was carrying an identical one on the day they killed him." Mary had heard, but it created a contradiction impossible to resolve. If the entire Oliver's family, including little Christine, had died more than 10 years ago on that terrible night, who was Claire? And why did she possess the talisman of a girl who had died so long ago? Mary returned to the Hill House with her mind in a whirlwind of confused thoughts. Mr. Jasper's revelation had not solved the mystery, but rather made it deeper and more painful. The house no longer seemed merely abandoned, but desecrated by a tragedy that refused to rest in peace. She looked at Claire, at the little girl who played in silence with smooth stones she had found in the creek, searching in her features for any trace of the Olivers family, of little Christine, but it was impossible to establish any connection. If Christine had died 10 years ago, Claire, with her mere 6 or 7 years of life, could not possibly be her. Was it then a cruel and disturbing coincidence? How had the hummingbird of a ghost girl come into her hands? The question tormented her, weaving a web of unease around her precarious peace. Every creak of the house, every shadow cast by the setting sun, now seemed to whisper Christine's name like a disturbing mantra. Mary clung to Claire with even greater ferocity, feeling that she was not only protecting her from hunger and cold, but also from a tangled and violent past that refused to remain buried in the shadows of time. Another whole week passed. Mary had managed to trade some of her clay figures for grains and vegetables at the market, enough to survive a few more days. Life had settled into a fragile but constant routine, one day following the other with comforting predictability. And then, on a muggy afternoon when the air foretold an imminent storm, she heard the unmistakable sound of a horse climbing the steep trail. Her heart leaped. No one ever climbed up to the foothills, much less to that house. She cautiously peered through the glassless window and saw a man dismounting in front of the property. He was tall and thin, but with the muscular build of someone accustomed to the harshness of farm work and the elements. He wore worn and dusty travel clothes, and his face, weathered by the relentless sun, was framed by dark hair and a several-day-old beard. He wasn't old, perhaps 35, but his eyes held that tired, hard look of someone who had seen too much, suffered too much. He took off his dust-stained hat and observed the house not with curiosity, but with a painful and profound familiarity. The man walked directly to the door, his boots marking a heavy, decided rhythm on the dry earth. Mary went to meet him, instinctively placing Claire behind her, protecting her with her own body. "What do you want, sir?" she asked, her voice sounding firmer than she truly felt inside. The man looked her up and down, and his expression was not friendly. It was a gaze that assessed, that judged, that measured. "This is my land," he said in a hoarse, rough voice, as if he wasn't accustomed to using it often. "This is my family's house, Who are you, and what are you doing here invading my property? Mary felt a chill run down her spine. Father Anthony gave me permission to live here. He said the house was abandoned, that no one from the family was left. The man let out a bitter, dry laugh, devoid of any joy or humor. Priests and rumors always get everything wrong. My name is Raphael Olivers, Anthony's brother, owner of this God-forsaken piece of hell. Mary's world shook. Mr. Jasper had said everyone had died in the war, in the rebellions. It can't be, she whispered, her voice weak. They said that you had died in the war like all the others. I've been close to death many times, he admitted, his eyes darkening as he evoked terrible memories. But death didn't want me yet. Now I've come back to reclaim what little remains of this cursed land. His gaze then fixed on the small figure timidly peeking from behind Mary's skirt. And this girl was also brought by the charitable priest? Before Mary could answer or invent an explanation, Claire, frightened by the stranger's harsh tone, raised the hand in which she clutched her only comfort, the carved wooden hummingbird. Raphael's eyes locked onto the small object as if he had seen a ghost. His hard face completely crumbled. The mask of toughness shattered, revealing an abyss of ancient, never-healed pain. He knelt slowly on the ground, unable to tear his gaze from the wooden figure. "That hummingbird," he said, his voice broken and trembling. "My brother Anthony carved it. It was my niece's. It was Christine's. How does this girl have it in her hands?" The silence that fell upon them was denser and heavier than the storm brewing on the distant horizon. Raphael remained kneeling on the ground, his gaze fixed on the hummingbird, a relic of a world he believed lost forever in the ashes of the past. Mary, with a heavy heart, felt the imperative need to defend her place there, to explain the miracle she had found in the midst of the most absolute desolation. "I found her right here," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "She was in the crumbling pantry basement, trapped down there. She had spent days there, almost dead from hunger and fear. I don't know who she is. I don't know where she came from. I only know that I saved her from death." Raphael lifted his gaze from the hummingbird and fixed it on Claire, but this time his expression was not hard. It was filled with agonizing, confused disbelief. "In the basement," he repeated, as if the words made no sense. He slowly rose, his body tense with a storm of contradictory emotions. Can I tell you something, ma'am? Something I haven't told anyone in these 10 long and bitter years." Mary nodded without removing her protective hand from Claire's shoulder, preparing to listen. "The night the government soldiers attacked," Raphael began, his voice hoarse with the weight of buried memories. "I was here visiting. I had come from the capital to see my brother. The war was at its height, and Anthony, my older brother, was a man of peace who only wanted to work his wood, but he gave shelter to anyone who needed it without asking which side they were on. Someone denounced him as a rebel sympathizer. They arrived at dusk, shouting accusations, shooting everywhere. They accused us of hiding weapons and wanted men. Anthony tried to explain, tried to reason with them, but no conversation was possible. It was a pure and simple massacre." He paused, swallowing with difficulty, his eyes lost in the horror of that night that never left him. "I saw when they killed Anthony and his wife Eleanor. I tried to defend them with what I had. They wounded me here," he said, pointing to a poorly healed scar that crossed his left temple. "I fell, and they left me for dead right there. When I woke up hours later, the house was on fire everywhere. The world was an inferno of flames and black smoke. I looked for Christine, my dear niece. I screamed her name until my lungs burned, but there was no answer. I never found her body anywhere. I assumed the worst, that the fire had consumed everything. I had to flee before they came back to finish me off for good. I lived these 10 years like a wandering ghost, working on distant farms, always with guilt gnawing at me for having survived when they didn't. He wiped a solitary tear that slid down his weathered, scarred face. I never forgave myself for not finding her body, for not giving her a burial, the rightful one. I always had that doubt stuck in my soul like a thorn, that foolish hope that maybe, in some impossible way, someone had taken her out of there before the flames consumed everything. He looked back at Claire, who watched him with her large, silent, frightened eyes, and then at the hummingbird she held, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. A light of impossible and miraculous understanding began to shine in his tired gaze. If this girl was in the cellar and had the hummingbird in her hands, oh my God, it can't be. The cellar has a hidden passage that leads down to the creek. Maybe Eleanor, maybe my sister-in-law hid her there before she was killed, hoping to come back for her later. He took another step closer, his hands visibly trembling. This girl, she can't be my Christine, can she? The name of the dead girl floated in the heavy air, laden with history and spilled blood. Mary felt the ground open beneath her feet once more. The name Christine echoed in the air like a funeral bell. She looked at Raphael, at this man who was a resurrected specter from the past, and saw in his eyes a hope so desperate and hungry that it deeply frightened her. Her first instinct was to pull back, to press Claire against her body even tighter, as if with that simple gesture she could anchor her to the present and protect her from a past that threatened to devour her completely. She perfectly understood his pain. The story he had told was an open wound, bleeding before her without cease. But Claire was hers. She had rescued her from the darkness, fed her with her own trembling hands, cradled her through nights of fear and nightmares. The bond that united them was not of blood, but forged in pure survival, and a love that had been born from the ashes of her own destroyed life. This man's arrival was not an answer from heaven. It was a direct threat to the only family she had left in the entire world. Raphael, for a moment ignoring Mary's presence, took another cautious step towards the girl, his hand outstretched, not to touch her, but as a silent, desperate plea. "Christine?" he whispered, the strange word on his lips after an entire decade of forced silence. "Is that you, little one? Do you remember Uncle Raphael?" Claire's reaction was immediate, visceral, instinctive. She hid completely behind Mary, her small body trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a choked sob, the first almost articulated sound Mary had heard from her, escaped her throat. It wasn't a formed word. It was pure animal terror. To her, Raphael wasn't a lost-and-found uncle. He was a stranger with a deep voice and an intimidating presence invading her safe sanctuary. Raphael's face twisted in pain at the clear rejection. It was a slap of reality harder than any physical wound. The niece he had lost in fire and blood didn't recognize him at all. To her, he was part of the threatening darkness, not the awaited salvation. He understood in that painful instant that he couldn't simply claim her as his property. The girl who had survived in the dark cellar was not the same one he remembered from happier times. Slowly withdrawing his hand, Raphael turned to Mary, his voice now stripped of its initial harshness and tinged with a vulnerable, humble plea. "Miss, please listen to what I have to say. I didn't come here to violently snatch her from you. I see how you care for her. I see the love in your eyes. You saved her life when no one else in the world would have. I owe you a debt I'll never be able to fully repay." He took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words that wouldn't sound aggressive. "But if she truly is Christine, she's my blood. She's all I have left of my brother and the family I lost that cursed night. I can't just leave and abandon her here without knowing the truth. Let me make a proposal. Allow me to stay around. I'll fix this house that's falling apart. I'll make it safe and livable. I'll bring food from the settlement whenever needed. I won't interfere in your lives. Just let me be near her. Help me discover the truth about who she really is. We can care for her together, each doing our part." The proposal was completely unexpected and caught Mary by surprise. It wasn't the violent confrontation she feared in her worst thoughts, but rather a truce, an unlikely alliance born from the shared love for that silent and mysterious girl. Mary looked at Claire, who clung to her skirt with desperate strength, and then at Raphael, a man as broken and destroyed inside as she herself was. She had no real choice. For Claire's sake, for her future, she had to accept the proposal, despite all its uncertainties. "All right," she finally said with a tired voice. "You can stay and help, but don't approach her if she doesn't want you to. I won't force anything. She has suffered enough." The first days that followed were a silent, awkward dance of strangers sharing the same space, sacred yet profaned by memories. A tacit agreement settled between them, a series of invisible rules that no one needed to verbalize. Raphael set up a simple camp outside, near the old ruined chicken coop, where he kept a fire burning all night, like a sleepless guardian against the shadows of the violent past and the real dangers of the foothills. During the day, he dedicated himself to resurrecting the house with a silent and stubborn energy, as if by repairing every rotten board and every loose brick, he could somehow mend the fractures of his own shattered soul. Mary and Claire remained inside the house, mainly in the kitchen, which had become their small, protected, and familiar universe. The only sound crossing the invisible border between the two worlds was Raphael's persistent hammer at work and Mary's soft voice singing lullabies to Claire. There was a constant, palpable tension in the air, an acute awareness of the other's presence that charged the atmosphere, but also a deep and genuine respect for each other's space and pain. They didn't talk about the future or what would come next. The present was too fragile a ground to bear the weight of plans or expectations. Raphael quickly proved to be a man of his word and principles. Every 3 or 4 days, he would go down to the settlement and return with his horse's saddlebags loaded with corn, dried meat, beans, and even some fruit when he could find it. On one occasion, he brought a simple but well-made rag doll, which he shyly left on the doorstep before retreating in silence. He fixed the roof that dripped in several places, reinforced the windows that threatened to fall, cleaned the well until the water ran completely clear, and in his moments of rest, he would sit in the shade of the old fig tree, and with a sharp knife he used for peeling roots, he carved small wooden figures with a skill inherited from his brother. A leaping deer, a howling wolf, an eagle with spread wings. He never offered the pieces directly to Claire. He simply left them strategically on the windowsill or at the edge of the well, where she might find them by chance and decide whether to pick them up or not. Claire observed everything from afar with cautious but growing curiosity. At first, she would hide whenever Raphael appeared in her line of sight, but gradually she began to peek from behind Mary, her eyes fixed on his skillful hands that transformed rough pieces of wood into small works of art. One morning, Mary found the rag doll beside Claire as she slept, hugged as if it were the most precious treasure. It was a small sign, but most significant. The weeks turned into a full month, then two. A strange, comforting normalcy settled into their routine. Raphael worked from dawn till dusk, gradually transforming the decaying house into something that felt like a real home again. Mary cared for Claire and returned to her pottery, using the rich clay from the creek to create pieces that Raphael would take to sell in the settlement, bringing back a little money that he meticulously divided with her. The people of the settlement began to murmur less and grow more accustomed to the strange situation. The story of the widow and the survivor living in the cursed house to care for a mysterious girl spread like wildfire. But it also sparked a certain reluctant admiration for their courage. Miss Benita would occasionally come up to examine Claire and always returned impressed with the girl's progress. "She's gaining weight, she's stronger. You're doing a good job with her," she'd say with genuine approval. It was on a June afternoon as the foothills chill began to intensify and Raphael finished repairing the last hole in the roof that the miracle happened that would change everything definitively. Claire was playing in the small space Mary had improvised as a studio, molding shapeless clay figures with childlike concentration. Raphael passed by carrying new planks for the basement, and for the first time, Claire neither hid nor looked away. She watched him work for several minutes in complete silence. Then, to everyone's absolute astonishment, Claire slowly stood up, picked up one of the small wooden figures Raphael had left, the leaping deer, and walked over to where he was working. She extended her hand, offering the figure back, and with a voice hoarse and weak from months of disuse, she spoke the first word anyone had heard from her. "Thank you." It was just an almost inaudible whisper, but it was as if the heavens had opened at that instant. Raphael dropped the planks with a thud, tears instantly welling in his tired eyes. He didn't move, not wanting to startle her with any sudden gesture. He just smiled, a broken but genuine smile. "You can keep it, little one. I made it for you." Claire looked at the figure, then at him, and finally back at the figure before nodding her head and running back to Mary, clutching her new treasure tightly. That night, for the first time since Raphael had arrived, the three ate together at the large kitchen table he had repaired. There wasn't much conversation. It was still too early for that, but there was something different in the air. There was the fragile but real possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, they could become something akin to a family born from shared ashes and pain. In the following weeks, Claire began to speak more, loose words and short sentences that came out with difficulty but with growing determination. And one night, as Mary was getting her ready for bed, the girl clutched the carved hummingbird to her chest and whispered something that made the world stop completely. "Daddy made it. Daddy sang." The confirmation they had both avoided facing directly had finally arrived unexpectedly. Claire was indeed Christine Olivers, the girl everyone believed dead 10 years ago, who had survived hidden in the secret basement during that horrible night, and who for some incomprehensible reason had remained trapped there until Mary found her. Mary felt her heart break and rebuild at the same time. Claire was Christine. She had family, she had blood, she had an uncle who loved her and had a right to her. But Mary also loved her with every fiber of her being, had saved her life when she was on the verge of death. The girl was hers as much as she was Raphael's. When she told Raphael what Claire had said, the man completely broke down, weeping tears he had held back for an entire decade of guilt and pain. But when he regained his composure, he looked into Mary's eyes with brutal honesty. "She is my niece, my blood. But you are the mother she knows, the mother who saved her and cared for her when I wasn't here. I won't take her from you. We will raise her together if you accept. This house is big enough for all of us. We can be a strange, broken family, but a family nonetheless. Mary looked around that house that had been her exile and was now her true home. She looked at Raphael, a good man hidden beneath layers of pain and loss. And she looked at Claire, the girl who had given new meaning to her empty life. Yes, she finally replied, with a tear-wet smile, we can be a family. The months that followed brought slow but steady healing for all three. Claire, or Christine as Raphael sometimes affectionately called her, truly began to blossom. She laughed now, played, helped Mary in the studio, and listened with fascination to the stories Raphael told about her father Anthony and the happy times before the tragedy. Little by little, fragments of memory began to return to her, confusing and frightening images of that terrible night, but also good memories from when she was very small. Raphael became a constant, protective presence. He finished all the house renovations, making it not just habitable, but truly welcoming. He built a new chicken coop and brought chickens from the settlement, planted a garden in the back where Claire loved to help water the plants every afternoon. And on cold winter nights, the three would sit around the wood-burning stove while Raphael carved his figures, Mary molded her ceramic pieces, and Claire drew with charcoal on smooth pieces of wood, creating her own fantasy worlds. The true story of what had happened that night 10 years ago was gradually pieced together, like a painful but necessary puzzle. Claire began to remember more clearly as she felt safer. She recounted in hesitant fragments how her mother, Eleanor, upon hearing the screams and gunshots approaching the house, had run with her in her arms to the secret basement the family used to store provisions. She had rushed down the stairs, placed Claire in the furthest corner on top of the sacks of grain, and desperately whispered to her to stay very, very still without making any noise, that she would be back for her soon. Claire had obeyed with the absolute terror of a child who senses danger without fully understanding it. She had stayed there in the dark, listening to terrible sounds coming from above. Screams, gunshots, the growing crackle of fire. She waited for hours that felt like eternities, waited for her mother to return as she had promised. But Eleanor never came back because she never could. The trapdoor, damaged by the fire and falling debris, had become blocked, turning the hiding place into a tomb. Claire had survived days in the dark, eating raw grains and licking the moisture from the walls, too small to have enough strength to push the heavy trapdoor, too small to cry out loud enough to be heard by anyone passing nearby. The trauma had erased much of her memories of the following years, creating a protective fog in her childlike mind. But the hummingbird her father had carved for her, which she clutched in her hand that night and never let go, had been her anchor to reality, her only comfort in the endless nightmare. Raphael listened to it all with a broken heart. Knowing his niece had been there alone, terrified, just a few feet from where he had woken up injured, was an additional burden of guilt he would carry forever. But Mary constantly reminded him that he too had almost died, that he had done what he could under the impossible circumstances of that night. The settlement gradually accepted the extraordinary situation. Father Anthony personally went up to see with his own eyes the miracle that had happened. He was deeply moved to see Claire alive and recovering, to see how Mary and Raphael had created a home where before there had only been abandonment and sadness. He blessed the house and the three who now inhabited it, declaring that it was proof that God never completely abandons his children, even in the darkest moments. Miss Benita, ever practical, helped spread the true story throughout the settlement, combating rumors and superstitions. Hill House ceased to be the cursed house and became known as the Miracle House, the place where a lost child had been found and where an impossible family had formed from the ruins of the past. And meanwhile, you who are joining us on this emotional journey, if this story has touched your heart in any special way, consider joining our community by subscribing to the channel. Every story we share here is chosen with great care to bring not only entertainment, but also reflection and hope. And we'd love to know in the comments below if you've ever experienced a moment when you thought all was lost, but something unexpected completely changed the course of your story. Your experience might be exactly the inspiration someone needs today not to give up. Let's build this community of real stories of overcoming and hope together. The first full year living together brought challenges that none of them had fully anticipated. Raphael and Mary had to learn to divide responsibilities and decisions about Claire without stepping on each other's toes. There were arguments, moments of tension when opinions diverged on the best way to deal with the girl's recurring nightmares, or on how much they should push her to remember the past versus letting her forget naturally. But they always found a middle ground, always putting Claire's well-being above their own egos or insecurities. And slowly, without either of them realizing exactly when it happened, Raphael and Mary developed a deep respect for each other that gradually transformed into something more. It wasn't the passionate love of youth, but something more solid and lasting, built on foundations of shared suffering, common goals, and genuine admiration for each other's character. It was Claire who first noticed the subtle change between them. She was now 8 full years old, they calculated, and was a perceptive child despite all the trauma she had suffered. One night, as the three dined on the stew Mary had prepared, Claire looked from one to the other with her intelligent eyes and asked with the brutal innocence of children, "Are you going to get married like my mom and dad did?" The silence that followed was charged with unspoken emotions, with possibilities unexplored until that moment. Raphael and Mary looked at each other across the table, both with flushed cheeks. Neither of them had consciously thought about it, or at least hadn't admitted it aloud. But Claire's question put on the table something that had already been in the air for months. "Would you like that?" Raphael asked Claire, his voice carefully neutral, not wanting to influence her. Claire nodded vigorously, a huge smile illuminating her face that had become so expressive compared to that frightened mask of months ago. "Then we would be a real family, like before." Mary felt tears sting her eyes. She looked at Raphael and saw in his eyes the same emotion, the same cautious hope. It wouldn't be a betrayal of Peter's memory. She knew that deep in her heart. Peter would have wanted her to be happy, to find a new reason to live. And Raphael wasn't a replacement. He was something completely different, a companion forged in the same flames of loss and rebirth that she had gone through. "I think that would be good," Mary finally said, her voice soft but firm. "If that's what we all want, if we can be a real family." Raphael reached across the table and Mary took his hand, their fingers intertwining with a naturalness that surprised them both. Claire clapped her hands delightedly, and for the first time in a long while, genuine, carefree laughter filled that house that had held so much silence and so much pain. They married in a simple ceremony in the settlement church 3 months later, with Father Anthony officiating and practically the entire community present to bear witness. It wasn't common, it was even scandalous for some of the more conservative, but most people had been touched by the extraordinary story of that unlikely family. Miss Benita was the unofficial matron of honor, helping Mary choose a simple but beautiful dress and braiding wildflowers into her hair. Claire was the flower girl, radiant in a new dress that Raphael had specially made for her, carrying a small basket with rose petals that she threw with exaggerated enthusiasm down the church aisle. The life they built together in the following years was neither perfect nor free of difficulties. Claire continued to have occasional nightmares, difficult days when memories returned with particular force. Raphael carried physical and emotional scars that would never fully heal. Mary sometimes still felt the sharp pain of Peter's loss, especially on significant dates. But they faced everything together, as a unit, as a family in the truest and deepest sense of the word. Mary's pottery studio grew and prospered. Her pieces began to be recognized in larger cities, bringing a stable income for the family. Raphael, who had learned the wood-carving craft from his brother Anthony, resumed the woodworking he had abandoned after the tragedy. His figures and sculptures found an appreciative market, and he began to teach the art to Claire, who showed a natural talent inherited from the father she had barely known. They expanded the house, adding more rooms because 2 years after the wedding, Mary discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy mixed with apprehension. She was 32 now, no longer so young for a first biological pregnancy. But Miss Benita accompanied her throughout all the months, and on a clear spring morning, Mary gave birth to a healthy boy they named Peter Anthony, honoring both Mary's first husband and Raphael's brother. Claire, now 10 years old, was absolutely delighted with the baby. She embraced the role of older sister with an adorable seriousness, helping with everything and declaring to anyone who would listen that she now had a real little brother. The baby's arrival completed the circle of healing that had begun that morning when Mary had heard the faint moans coming from the basement. The years succeeded one another with the strange speed that time has when life is full and meaningful. Peter Anthony grew robust and cheerful, followed 2 years later by a little sister they named Rose Eleanor, honoring the grandmothers the children would never know. Hill House, once so silent and haunted, now constantly resonated with children's laughter, with the sound of the pottery wheel spinning, with Raphael's rhythmic carving, with conversations around the large table at meals. Claire grew into a talented and strong young woman, bearing the marks of her traumatic past, but never allowing them to fully define her. She became an artist in her own right, combining the carving techniques Raphael taught with the pottery she learned from Mary, creating unique pieces that fused wood and clay in innovative ways. Adorations. Her most precious work, which she would never sell for any price, was a large sculpture of a woman holding a child, with a hummingbird perched on the woman's shoulder. It was her tribute to all the mothers she had had, to Eleanor, who had saved her by hiding her on that terrible night, and to Mary, who had found her and given her a second chance at life. The settlement also prospered over the years, and the story of the Hill House family became a local legend, told and retold with variations, but always maintaining its core of truth and hope. Young couples facing difficulties would climb up to the house to ask for advice from Raphael and Mary, who always received them with generosity and wisdom hard-earned through their own trials. Father Anthony, already very old, visited regularly and always said that this family was living proof that God writes straight with crooked lines, that even from the deepest tragedies, something beautiful and redemptive can be born. Miss Benita, who lived to be 93, always referred to Claire as her personal miracle, the child who should have died, but who not only survived but flourished in extraordinary ways. And Mary, on quiet nights when everyone was asleep and she was alone with her thoughts in the kitchen that had become the pulsating heart of that home, sometimes reflected on the impossible path her life had taken. It had begun in the deepest despair, widowed and helpless, exiled in a house everyone avoided. She could have chosen bitterness. She could have allowed herself to be consumed by self-pity and despair. But instead, she had found purpose in the most unexpected place, in the faint whimper of an abandoned child no one knew was there. That single decision to follow that sound instead of fleeing from it, to descend into that dark basement instead of running down the mountain, had changed not only her life, but also the lives of Raphael and all the children who came after. It had transformed a house of death into a house of abundant life. Sometimes Mary would pick up the original hummingbird that Anthony had carved for Christine, which Claire had carefully kept in a special box, and hold it delicately, marveling at how something so small could carry so much meaning, so much history. Raphael often joined her in these moments of silent reflection. They would sit side by side without needing words, two survivors who had found each other through the fog of their respective losses. He would sometimes caress her hair, now with some silver strands, and whisper, "You saved her. You saved me too. You brought back the life I thought I had lost forever." And Mary always responded in the same way. "We saved each other. That's how it works. No one saves themselves alone in this life." It was the deepest truth they had learned through everything they had been through. Redemption, healing, hope, none of that happens in an isolated vacuum. It happens in the connections we make, in the love we choose to give, even when all seems lost, in the courage to reach out to another human being who is also suffering. The years continued their inexorable flow. Peter Anthony became a young scholar who wanted to be a teacher, bringing education to forgotten rural communities. Rose Eleanor inherited the family's artistic spirit and excelled in music, her clear voice filling the house and then the churches of the region. And Claire, her Christine, married a good man from the neighboring settlement, a carpenter who deeply admired her strength and her art. When Claire had her own daughter, there was no discussion about the name. They called her Mary, and little Mary had the same expressive and intelligent eyes as her adoptive grandmother. The circle was complete in a way no one could have predicted that March morning so many years ago. From death and despair had come abundant life and love that multiplied through generations. The Hill House remained standing, solid and welcoming, its walls guarding memories of tragedy, but also and mainly memories of healing, of laughter, of shared meals, of art created, of children growing up safe and loved. And when occasional visitors, drawn by the fame of the pottery and carving pieces that came from that house, asked about the history of the place, Claire always told them personally. She told it without shame or fear. She told it with the firm voice of someone who had traversed the worst life could offer and had emerged, not broken, but strengthened. She told about the mother who had hidden her to save her, about the lost years in the dark, about the courageous woman who had found her when no one else was looking, about the uncle who had returned from the dead to reclaim his family. And she always ended in the same way, looking at Mary and Raphael, who were now growing old together with a quiet grace. Sometimes miracles are not supernatural events that defy the laws of nature. Sometimes miracles are just ordinary people making extraordinary choices of love and courage when it would be easier to give up. My family exists because 3 broken people chose to come together and create something new from the shattered pieces. That is the true miracle, the human capacity to rebuild, to restart, to love again even after losing everything. And now, reaching the end of this journey we have shared together, I would like to personally invite you to become a permanent part of our community here. If this story has touched you in any way, if it has made you reflect on your own capacity to restart or on the silent miracles that happen around us every day, please consider subscribing to the channel. Every story we bring here is chosen and told with the aim of inspiring, of reminding us that even in the darkest moments, there is always a possibility of light if we have the courage to look for it. Leave in the comments which part of this story resonated most with you. Was it Mary's courage to restart in a place everyone feared? Was it Raphael's persistence in returning and facing his past? Was it Claire's resilience to survive and eventually flourish despite unimaginable trauma? Or was it perhaps the idea that families can be formed not only by blood, but by conscious choices of love and commitment? Your perspective is valuable and can illuminate the path of another person who is going through their own difficulties right now. And if you know someone who is going through a difficult time, who feels they have lost everything and sees no way out, share this story with that person. Sometimes all we need is a reminder that others have been where we are and found a way forward. Not an easy way, certainly, but a possible way. Until the next story, always remember, you are stronger than you imagine, more resilient than you believe, and never, never truly alone, as long as the possibility of genuine human connection exists. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, and may you find your own path to the light, no matter how dark the night seems right now.